All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's give it a minute to let people enter. And then we'll slowly get started. Okay, I think we start there. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by the Geography of Sustainability Transition subgroup of the Sustainability Transition Research Network. So that's been Christian Binz, Camilla Klebna, Sofia Olbu, Mari Vardeberg, and myself organizing this webinar series. For your information, this webinar is being recorded, similar to the other 3 webinars we already did, and the recordings are made available online, so you're aware of that. Please also make sure that you mute, so not to disturb the presenters. We'll get back to how we do in the Q&A after the presentations by Mary Lawhon and Gavin Bridge. But just a very quick introduction to those who haven't been following any of the webinars so far. So, well, why are we doing this? It is because I think the first main reason is that nature is largely absent both in economic geography and sustainability transitions research, and also at this intersection of what we refer to as the geography of sustainability transitions. So there's a lot of really good and important reasons to take nature more seriously, both conceptually and empirically. But it's far from clear how we should do that. And what we then wanted to do with this webinar series was to kind of open this discussion, invite different people with different perspectives on this topic who've already worked in this space and also in adjacent spaces to who have started conceptualizing this relationship more, and see how this can inform our work in the geography of sustainability transitions field. So we already have these 3, I think, great webinars with a lot of participants and good discussions. And we've also really looked forward to this final one with Mary Lawhon and Gavin Bridge on what insights we can gain from a political ecology perspective. So really looking forward to that. And well, the speakers now, Professor Mary Lawhon from University of Edinburgh. I'll give you the opportunity to introduce yourself properly and say a little bit more about your research before you start your presentation. But very happy to have you here, Mary, and Professor Gavin Bridge from the University of Durham. Very happy to have also you here. So I think you come into this from slightly different angles, different empirical domains and different research questions, but both having engaged with political ecology in your work. So I think this is going to be very interesting. So Gavin and Mary will both have about 15 minutes each for their presentations, and then we do a Q&A after that. And I'll get back to some of the functionality of how we do the questioning when the presentations have ended. So without further ado, I'd like to give the digital floor to Mary. So I'll stop sharing and you can share your slides, Mary.
Should be coming. Let's see. Hopefully you can all see that.
Yes, we see the slides.
There we go. Great. So thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to be here and wrapping up what's been a really exciting group of seminars. So I, as it says in my official professor title, I self-identify as a political ecologist. But I think a lot about socio-technical transitions. My PhD fieldwork was on electronic waste, with the conceptual frameworks that I used for thinking about political ecology and sustainability transitions together. So when I got the invitation for this, I thought, I mean, it's a little bit of old stuff, but I have continued to be thinking about the intersection of these two fields for a very long time, even though sometimes I don't always use the terms sustainability transitions. So I thought I'd start with just a couple of slides on kind of my understanding of political ecology. Like many fields, we debate and discuss where the true origins are and the real meanings are. But for me, I think the simplest and for me most useful way to think about political ecology is to think of it as the sort of 2-year-old toddler version of environmental studies, where political ecologists are always asking why this, why that, why is it this way? And to trace what was in the early versions called a chain of explanation, more recently referred to as a web of relations, but to go back beyond the biophysical explanations for environmental studies until we get to social systems as causes. So it's not to deny biophysical problems are real, environmental problems are real, but instead of saying carbon causes climate change, is to ask, why do we produce carbon? Who produces carbon? But also to focus not just on individuals, but the social systems that lead to the problems we have in sustainability. Political ecology has kind of two dominant things that it does, and one is very much what Paul Robbins, one of our key scholars in political ecology, calls the hatchet. As the name implies, that's where we critique things and say what's terrible and wrong with the world and why it's unsustainable. But also, I would say a smaller in the size of the metaphor, but also smaller in terms of how much scholars focus on this, a seed. And I think this is where the transitions literature is quite complementary, or there's potential for more synergies in terms of thinking about what are these directions we want to have. Great to do the critique, but we also want to move beyond critique to say, what are examples of good things that we would like to see, examples of better sustainability? So if you think of political ecology as the why, and thinking about power and systems and why we have the problems that we have, you can kind of imagine how that might relate to the kind of multi-level perspective. And I know there's other ways of thinking about transitions. I find the sort of multi-level perspective language to be useful, although I know we can critique and go beyond it. What I've been most interested in lately is thinking about some of those broader landscape factors and how they come down to shape the technological interventions. So again, even when I'm not using multi-level perspective language, thinking about the relationship between those different, not quite scales, but levels. And thinking about how imaginaries, these really big ways of understanding the world, are socially constructed, are often taken for granted, particularly in transition studies. I think we often treat those landscape factors as static, as things that will influence the regime and shape the regime, rather than things that are fluid, or things that we might question, or things that we might interrogate further. So I've been trying to ask questions about why certain landscape factors are dominant and how they shape the regime and how they shape the potential for niches to reshape the regime. Much kind of academic scholarship is stuck in what I call a sort of modernist versus anti-modern binary. So if you, I could elaborate on this more. This is a quick point here, but it really shapes my entry point, that we in development studies and urban studies are often stuck in a kind of analytical binary between modern and a sort of Arcadian or traditional, if you're in development studies, post-development narrative. And I'm going to try to land that in infrastructure. So we have these big, broad debates about how we understand the world through imaginaries. And we have some analytical vocabulary from environmental studies and development studies that shape how we understand the world. And I'm interested in thinking about what other imaginaries there might be that could be landscape factors, that could be under-examined imaginaries, and how those different imaginaries might enable different kinds of technology to emerge, might enable a different kind of relationships at that regime level. So to ground this, because I know that was a very abstract couple of slides there, to ground this, I want to have a few minutes, my sort of that was this setup, but to talk a little bit about infrastructure to try to ground this. I think infrastructure is really interesting to think about. It's sort of a nice grounding between these broad ideas that we might have around structures and power and sort of very material things of pipes and wires and what makes other things move. But in kind of more so than many different other kinds of materials, infrastructure is all about connections. And it's all about making collective decisions that limit our individual agency through our decisions to share certain ways of doing our material infrastructure. Infrastructure studies is a sort of growing field in relation to sustainability, but I would say for about 50 years, let's say between the 60s and early 2000s, we had a pretty clear understanding of what good infrastructure is. Sure, there were people questioning it, but as I'll show in the next slide, nope, 2 more slides. The modern infrastructure ideal became this hegemonic way of understanding what good infrastructure is. It was a grid. Everyone was supposed to be connected. All of our infrastructures were supposed to be the same. And that became understood as the key way of doing infrastructure. Environmentalists have critiqued it for it not being sustainable, but we also have seen in the Global South that that pathway has not come about in the way that many people expected. Some people are critical and say the Global South should just develop the modern infrastructure ideal the same way as happened in the Global North. But what we see in practice is a lot of different alternatives emerging. I've tried to argue that thinking about these as infrastructure configurations is a useful vocabulary for trying to think beyond just the static pipes and wires of infrastructure, but to look at the people who are doing labor to make this infrastructure work, and also to think about infrastructures as being related even when they're not connected by pipes and wires. So again, I'll land this a little bit more in a minute, but from what I've been trying to think through, connecting political ecology to these questions of infrastructure is to say, let's not assume we know what the good infrastructure is, but instead ask, why do we have a certain kind of infrastructure? Why do we also assume that a certain kind of infrastructure is the good and right kind of infrastructure? Why has the modern ideal become so hegemonic? And also what other alternatives might be out there? So to do that, why of political ecology, and ask why is this the dominant way of doing it, but also to ask the politics question of political ecology. Who benefits from certain ways of doing infrastructure? I also want us to think a little bit, as we're relating it back to this question of imaginaries and the topic for today, about what understandings of nature lie behind these infrastructures. Because a modernist idea of nature is very different than an Arcadian version of nature. And as I'll suggest in a few minutes, I think there's also other ways of understanding nature that shape what kind of infrastructures we think are good. So to ground it here, this is an example. I study sanitation. Everybody loves talking about toilets. I say that with a little bit of jest, but it's actually been a really useful example for thinking about the modern ideal, but also the growing prevalence of other alternatives that are not actually bad infrastructure, they're just different infrastructure. So for those of you familiar with the kind of classic modern infrastructure ideal here, there was a splintering of it that happened through privatization in big companies, but the sort of political agenda from many people, including political ecologists, was we want to fight to get the modern ideal back again. In the Global South, people raised questions about the value of focusing on modern infrastructure when modern infrastructure is not what most people use. But many informal infrastructures are not great ones. And so there was this sort of strange moment of limbo in the academic conversation where we said, modern infrastructure is a problem in certain ways, it's absent in other places. There is this informal infrastructure, but we're not sure we want to get behind pit latrines for everyone. And the conversation kind of got stuck. But in practice, engineers and city planners weren't stuck. What they were doing was exploring other kinds of doing sanitation, other ways of doing it, other kinds of technologies. And so I came into studying toilets at a moment where these other kinds of toilets were existing in practice, But social scientists had not really tried to explain why some people were advocating this alternative kind of infrastructure. They were writing about kind of, do people like it or don't they, but not trying to tease out how this niche might relate to, if you think in transitions language, might relate to these wider landscape factors. Yeah, they were sort of thinking about, can we get this to become part of the regime or even displace sewers in the regime, but not paying attention to these sorts of imaginaries that shape whether or not people would accept these toilets, but also whether or not people would imagine them as better, preferable in certain kinds of ways. So what I tried to do was to write through a political ecology explanation of why is modern so powerful and present, but also to try to tease out an alternative and sort of using these alternative toilets as a potential seed. I in earlier stages was more or less unsure of whether or not this is a good seed that we want to grow, but I think it's increasingly clear to me there might be a good seed here for us to follow, but also to think about, again, to articulate this imaginary that is different from a modern imaginary, is different from an Arcadian imaginary. And in teasing that out, trying to describe not just kind of the imaginary of the toilet, but to try to understand how this really different way of understanding the world was emergent in many places. And it gave me some ways of understanding an alternative to this long-standing binary between a modern and an anti-modern discourse in environmental studies and development studies. And so I'm blasting through these slides, more than happy to share them, or of course go back to them if there's details to be chasing here. But as I work towards wrapping up, the final slide here. So in short, what I've been trying to think through is, as we're imagining these different sustainability transitions, how do we, as the multi-level perspective suggests, not just focus on the niche and regime, but also think about how the landscape enables certain kinds of technologies, but also to not treat that landscape as known and also not treat it as static, but instead try to use toilets as an example for understanding how these sort of under-articulated landscape factors might be shaping why certain technologies are being promoted, and that by naming them, we can pay better attention to them and have a better explanation for why some of these technologies might actually fit better, might actually be more sustainable, might actually be politically opening space for a very different kind of politics than a modern sewer does. So some of the studies that we've done empirically have been to try to understand how and why different kinds of social relations happen around these alternative infrastructures. And because I think of these through political ecology, to be able to ask questions about what kinds of power relations are enabled by these, what kinds of power relations are troubled by these. What does this mean for the role of the state? What does it mean for different kinds of entrepreneurial activities? How does this differ from the kind of modernist critique that the critique of modernization and the privatization from those earlier political ecological studies? So in short, asking these big questions, but also trying to really ground it in, there are certain kinds of toilets that might actually be the kinds of toilets we want to transition to for a more sustainable future. I know that was a lot to dump into 15 minutes, but I thought it would be better to get the big arc, get the big picture, and happy to point you to more stuff and answer questions as we go. That's me.
All right, thank you. Let's give Mary the applause button. And we then transition over to Gavin. I put a message in the chat about using the Teams Q&A function to pose your question and start thinking about those. You can also vote for other people's questions, and please keep your questions short and as clear as possible. Okay, so with that, over to you, Gavin.
That's great. Thank you, Markus. Can you hear me and can you see me okay? Perfect. Well, thank you very much indeed. And thanks to Mary for some really helpful ideas there. I think we've got a lot of complementary points to make, but also some differences, which is quite exciting. I really value the invitation to be part of this series and really appreciate the work that's gone on behind to create this regular space for an exchange of ideas around the geographies of sustainability transitions. It's a really valuable contribution. So I'll just say a few opening words, a bit of context. So I trained as an economic geographer and as a resource geographer. And initially my work has been on extractive industries. So my PhD in the US was on the environmental origins and consequences of restructuring in the US copper industry. And I was doing at that time something that others later would refer to as a kind of first world political ecology. But since then, I've continued to do work on the primary sector with work on oil and gas and other extractives, which about 10 years or so ago led to some work more directly on the geographies of energy and of energy transition. I've continued to think widely about the political economy of extraction and materials, including co-editing the Routledge Handbook of Political Ecology with Tom Perot and James McCarthy. Working with two really excellent Chilean political ecologists, Beatriz Bustos and Manuel Prieto, and being involved first at Manchester and then at Durham with an EU-funded project called Entitle, which some colleagues on the call may know well, which trained 16 PhDs in political ecology across Europe. That was led by Yorgos Kallis and Christos Zographos at Barcelona. So my work recently, though, is involved, increasingly involving work on the geopolitics of energy transition. So I'm doing some work at the moment with colleagues at Warwick University and some case study work on battery minerals and supply chains. Some of that has been done with Erica Fagin, who's now at the University of Vienna. And I'm currently at the start of a 4-year follow-on project on the geopolitics of low carbon transition that's funded through the UK Energy Research Centre. So in that work, we're focusing on critical minerals, we're focusing on international interconnectors for electricity supply, and we're also doing some further battery work. So a couple of weeks ago, for example, we did an online webinar with the International Energy Agency talking about some of the relationships between our different sets of work, and I can share a link to that if anyone's interested. But I'm not going to talk about any of that today, because the theme of today's seminar is what insights can we gain from a political ecology perspective. So rather than present a paper on my recent work, I've decided to tackle the seminar theme head on. So my title then, you can see in front of you, What is Political Ecology Good For?, is an effort to try and respond directly to the seminar theme. And just to kind of cut to the chase, I'm going to make 4 points over the course of the next 10 minutes or so. It's going to be about land, it's going to be about critiques of transition, it's going to be about the making of economic objects, and it's going to be about social power. So that's where we're going. First, though, I need to get a few kind of cautious caveats out the way. I once heard somebody describe this as academic throat clearing. It's not a particularly nice metaphor, but it does kind of resonate, I think, with the idea of preparing to say something, needing to get something out of the way. So first of all, and I'm being completely transparent here, I'm trained in the borderlands of economic and resource geography, and I'm not a card-carrying political ecologist. So unlike Mary, I don't self-identify as a political ecologist. I came to political ecology several years after my PhD, and I've spent some time in that area, and I've done some things and learned a lot by working together with genuine political ecologists. But I still have, for better or worse, some of that outsider's perspective. The second thing to say is this is going to be inevitably a really partial account. Political ecology is broad, it's diverse conceptually, methodologically, geographically, and its outlines are perhaps clearer about what it is when you're further away than when you get close up. It gets really fuzzy when you really get close to what are the edges of this field. It started as an insurgent challenge to dominant perspectives in resource and environmental management, but it's enormously proliferated so that it is arguably now, outside of mainstream economics, it's arguably one of the main lines of social inquiry into environmental change. So if it's gone from that insurgent position to becoming somewhat dominant. And we might say a little bit more about that in the questions. But my point here is that any of the claims that I want to make about political ecology today are about part of that body of work, not about all of it. And related to this is a little bit about a linguistic legacy. So when I'm talking about political ecology, I'm referring in the main here to work in the Anglo-American tradition of political ecology. And I want to recognise straight away that political ecology has plural linguistic origins. There is a Francophone tradition, there's a Spanish language school, and then there's a Spanish language school which has strong Latin American roots as well. And there's roots of political ecology in the Caribbean, in diaspora societies. And there's emerging work, really strong work, coming out of settler colonial societies as well. So it's plural in multiple ways, but the references that I'm going to make to it here are principally about that Anglo-American tradition. And finally, the third caveat, just to get it out of the way, is that my chosen title, What is Political Ecology Good For?, appears to privilege some kind of utility, being good for something. And I think that's really effective as a starting point for conversation. That's why I chose it. But I also think there's something, quite fundamentally, I think there's something about a perspective that exceeds, is beyond its utility. So we might talk, for example, about the beauty or the joy or the inspiration or the humility, in fact, even that comes from recognizing the difference of a perspective. And I think we need to, particularly now, we need to hang on to that. So I don't want to reduce everything here to some sort of utilitarian account of what can you make it do. Although inevitably, I'm going to have to focus on that in what I say next. So as a place to begin here, I really like the early presentations of the geographies of sustainability transitions as being a kind of conceptual trading zone. I think that's a really fertile language, a useful language. And the need in that trading zone to draw in additional insights to innovation studies and human geography to understand processes that are shaping the pace, the scope, and the direction of transition. But I think if we push that a little harder about political ecology, that kind of sets us up for really two rather different types of orientation. So in the first of these, it might be more in that mode of the seed, to use Mary's allusion to Paul Robbins' metaphor of the hatchet and the seed. The seed is the idea of a set of inspiration, an additionality, if you like. What might political ecology inspire, or how can it enhance existing work? But there's a second orientation here that's perhaps a little more critical, which is to say, what is the problem that the geographies of sustainable transitions already has, and how might political ecology work to solve that? So that's some sense of a critique where there's a deficit, the identification of a deficit in existing work that political ecology might seek to address. Now, I'm not going to take a view on either of those positions at the moment, but I do think it's something we want to bear in mind when we're asking that question, what are we doing in this trading zone? Are we looking for other ideas to expand the domain of thinking, or are we really looking for a tool to help us solve some problem that we've got? Because that latter does require us to do a pretty substantive critique of where are our problems, what are the nature of that problems, and is political ecology actually cut out to solve that problem that we identify? But I think going into this that there are some really good starting points for thinking that there might be a trading zone here. So to name a few rather obvious ones, there's a shared broad political economy framing. There's some attention to place in both traditions of thought, but place always within a multi-scalar perspective. There's a tradition of working with mixed methods, some interest in working quantitatively as well as qualitatively. There's perhaps some experience with collaborative practices, by which I mean working in research with non-academic partners. And there is, of course, the underpinning idea of socio-environmental change as a core problematic, whether that is the narrative of transition or whether it's to understand a process of environmental change. So here what I want to do is to try and identify four main areas of intersection where political ecology might have something substantive to say to work on geographies of sustainability transition. And the first of these is about land. So any passing familiarity with political ecology will quickly recognise that certainly in its foundational work and continuing as a very strong theme today are questions of land. So land use, land as property, and the conflicts that can occur in and around land. And so by taking land as its entry point, as its empirical case material, that helps us immediately, I think, to foreground some rather different geographies in accounts of transition. So it helps us think initially perhaps about rural spaces, about the peri-urban fringe, and indeed about marine spaces that may not necessarily appear in our straightforward accounts of innovation and sustainability transition. So it draws our attention to some other spaces, other parts of the space economy. In centering land, it also helps us focus on primary production of raw materials and thinking of land as a source, but also, of course, as a place in which to deposit a series of materials, a sink function. So we can start to account in here by centering land the duality of ways in which land functions within a metabolic system, provisioning materials and absorbing waste. But land for political ecologists is so much more than that source and sink function. It's critically a site for what scholars in the agrarian tradition talk about social reproduction. So in other words, livelihoods, sustaining life and body through interacting with land, reproducing forms of society, whether that be family unit, kinship unit, community organization, through interactions in and around land. Classically in agrarian settings, but we could think too through to plantation agriculture and to a host of other land-based activities. And the way that if you think about land in this social reproduction mode, it helps us recognize that there are at least some forms of structuring tensions with thinking about land as a source of raw material supply or as a sink function. So there are a range of social dynamics occurring around land that political ecology is well experienced in understanding and has a repertoire of concepts and empirical evidence that can help us understand what transition might mean when we center that land function. To give one small example of that, that's probably familiar already to a number of people on the call, is the idea that as we move in an energy transition towards more renewable energy resources, based on classically on solar and wind, we're shifting from a vertical energy regime based on the extraction of fossil fuels to one in which land becomes once again a principal provider of energy materials. So there's a trade-off here between the energy density of the materials and the power density required to generate electricity through solar and wind, for example. Matt Huber and James McCarthy did a very nice piece articulating that dynamic of the vertical to the horizontal. And around land are a series of other dynamics that involve financialization. So land then becomes a multi-layered unit for thinking about a series of interactions and social dynamics. And if you center land, then you start to highlight a series of distributional and often extra local, beyond the initial site, consequences of transition. So we can think about work on land appropriation and the grabbing of space to bring it into production for a new energy economy, for example. We can think about work in the food sector, food regime research, which shows how efforts to drive profits in the consumption end squeeze supply chains, squeeze labour, force dispossession of land, squeeze wages. And so we've got accounts here of the supply chain which centre on those interactions back at the upstream site through what happens to primary producers. And then there's a series of what political ecologists, particularly those from the Barcelona tradition with Joan Martínez-Alier and colleagues, refer to as ecological distribution conflicts. So unfair access to natural resources and the unjust burdens of pollution. So here's an example. Again, people may well be familiar with this work. It's not mine. This is work, the Environmental Justice Atlas, the product of Joan Martínez-Alier and colleagues at Barcelona, which really maps out some of these conflicts over land at those points of provision in global supply chains. And behind this is a whole repertoire of empirical and conceptual case study work that helps us think about social metabolism, about ideas of ecologically unequal exchange through trade, about climate extractivism through investment, and green sacrifice zones. And all of these, I think, can help us think through the lens of land about what transition means in a series of extra local sites. So to the second of the four things that I want to put on the table, it would be the idea that political ecology has long-standing critiques of transition and indeed other narratives of environmental improvement. Indeed, Tanya Murray Lee, a fantastic book called The Will to Improve, shows how the idea of improvement, kind of ecological modernization, if you like, of intervening in landscapes or intervening in economic systems to drive some form of improvement, has a long and rather troubled history that goes right back to the colonial period. And if you look at some of the foundational work in political ecology, it took issue with narratives of soil degradation, of constraints around carrying capacity and scarcity, or ideas that land needed to be conserved and protected to conserve particular species, or the idea that land was going to waste. And use those arguments that are often rooted in an ecological account of scarcity to say what happens when those narratives get mobilized through a lens of improvement to, in effect, reinforce existing power hierarchies, leading to forms of control over vulnerable and marginalized people and processes of dispossession. So there is, if you like, hardwired into political ecology, a critique of a transition narrative. There are more specific critiques too, critiques of adaptation and resilience. Adaptation is what's essential to narratives today of addressing, mitigating and adapting to climate change. Resilience is a central metaphor and boundary object that enables a range of researchers and practitioners to convene around various environmental problems. And there is a long-standing critique within the political ecology literature of adaptation as identifying proximate rather than structural processes, and as effectively being a passive or reactive series of adjustments rather than dealing with structural conditions in society at large. There's a critique too that suggests that adaptation is effectively a retreat of the state, a form of abjection, the state throwing responsibility for survival onto local peoples. They need to adapt rather than providing provision for adjustment. So a key question there in that work always has been who has to adapt. There's similar work, more recent work in the decolonial scholarship tradition, particularly coming out of settler colonial societies, some in the Nordic countries, for example, looking at questions of, well, whose transition is this? Sami people from Sapni, for example, recognizing that the wind projects and other resource acquisition projects on their territories are part of a long-standing record of land interventions by the state in controlling access and use of materials. And recognizing that transition in that context, who is being asked to bear the costs of an energy transition? And an answer to that, it is people who are very low energy users in the first place. So some sense of the injustice underpinning accounts of transition. And the last point I'd make on this critiques of transition is the idea of the transition narratives can often occlude, draw our attention away from important aspects of continuity in forms of structural relations. What Jamie Jones, in a really brilliant book called Rendering Obsolete, talks about as being the problem of tidy vanishing, that old energy systems go away in a context of transition and we focus on the new. Whereas what political ecology research tells us, particularly that working on energy systems, like the work of Jen Bakker and Tyler Harlan, focuses on the way renewable energy landscapes appear stacked on existing fossil systems. And we need to always understand the interaction of these two things together. Some great work by Douglas Robb and colleagues from University of British Columbia on the way that decarbonisation in British Columbia, hydroelectricity projects, solar projects, for example, are integral to the continuation of a fossil fuel regime around gas extraction, for example. Or we might think about the way that big oil is becoming in front of our eyes big wind. So what looks like a transition at the technological level at a structural organizational forms of capital looks very, very similar. So briefly to the final 2 points I want to make. The third of these is really to think about, so I was struck by Markus's encouragement at the beginning, the idea behind the seminar series of thinking about ways of bringing nature empirically into questions of economy. And I think this is something that political ecology does very well. It does it both through sort of classic modes of political economy, ideas about appropriation, for example, of commodification and marketization, but it also does it through the engagement with science and technology studies, thinking about ways of rendering visible, rendering legible, rendering actionable, for example, and the devices that enable landscapes, places, and materials to be made tractable, to be made adaptable and modifiable for particular ends. So what I'm trying to get at here is the work on ecologies and landscapes as political and economic objects. Now, what's really interesting in this work, and this is, I'm trying to do some work in this space myself, so I'm kind of naturally enthusiastic about this, but what's interesting here, I think, is that there's an attention to really different modes of economy taking place at once around particular economic objects. So materials being rendered into a commodity for exchange, at the same time they're also rendered into assets that can be turned into a revenue stream or made to bear debt, at the same time as they're often turned into forms of infrastructure. So there, if you like, there are multiple forms of economy taking place around these economic objects at a single point. And this work in political ecology really helps us think about differences of economic objects and the intersection of these around particular materials. And I think it's quite helpful as a way of thinking about the tractability, the way in which places, landscapes, and indeed specific materials can be incorporated into, become actionable as part of a transition project. I've been doing some work recently with a PhD student at Uppsala, Naima Kreischer-Freysen, on rendering the North Sea into a space of energy capture. And we were interested in the way that the North Sea presents different affordances for energy capture in the movement from oil and gas to to wind, and now to hydrogen, and for carbon capture and storage. This is also something I've written about in a rather different context, thinking about the idea of extraction, thinking about how the X and the tract in that word imply rather different conceptual orientation. Can you hear me still?
You were muted for a second, but we hear you now.
Okay. I will wrap up. That may have been a signal to wrap up. In which case, I will take it as such and wrap up. Finally, the fourth thing I'll just put on the table here is, and Mary did a fantastic job of explaining how political ecologists always ask why, and I absolutely agree. I think they also ask who, for whom. So if there is sort of one foundational element here, I would say it's Henry Bernstein, long-standing political ecologist working in the agrarian political economy tradition, is credited with what someone once referred to as Bernstein's haiku, a very simple poetic form, and it takes the form of these four questions: who owns what, relations of property, who does what, thinking about social division of labour, who gets what, the social distribution of products of that labour, and then what do they do with it. So at the core of political ecology, I would say, and this is the point I will stop with, is a ceaseless, unrelenting set of questions about who. And so in the context of transition, it would principally be around for whom is transition. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gavin. And once again, we press the applause button. All right, great. Now, people, time to put your questions in the Q&A, if you have them, or you can vote for other people's questions, and we'll get right to it, I think. There is a question from Suyash Jolly. It's not addressed to anyone specific, but the question is, how can political ecology lens be useful to conceptualize green neighborhoods in large cities that help to enhance the community spirit and greater personal bonding between citizens and socially marginalized communities living, for example, in ghettos? I assume that question will go to you, Mary, at least first.
I think I didn't catch all of it. I don't know if we can see the question somewhere.
You should be able to see the questions. if you click on the Q&A in the top bar.
There it is. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah. So this was the
I'll step
question
behind
from Suyash Jolly.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I now I've got the question. Thank you for walking me through the technology. Not my strongest suit. I think for me it does come back around to these questions where Gavin was just leaving us. I think asking questions around who and why are so often absent from the way that many environmentalists would kind of and planners and would approach these kinds of questions in the beginning, right? That we assume we know what the answer is, and then we try to make people adopt a technology or adopt a practice. And I think that the core thing that political ecologists would contribute in this case would be to ask, right, why is that green neighborhood? Why are those the technologies that we're trying to convince people to use? Why are they not wanting to use them? Who benefits from them using them? Why do some people benefit and why don't people benefit? And I think there's going to be different answers to that based on the different cases. But I think it would just be that political ecological approach of going in and instead of blaming the individuals for not being sustainable already and focusing on the aspect of individual choice, which is so often the case, to instead look at those structural reasons why it isn't already that way.
Would you like to add to anything to that, Gavin?
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting question. It made me think about some work in urban political ecology on the way that projects of greening are often aligned with racialization, with the whitening of neighborhoods, and the way that environmental objectives can work to reproduce existing racialized hierarchies in urban areas. So work by Harold Perkins, for example, or Laura Pulido, Harold Perkins in the Midwest in the US, Laura Pulido in California. There is other work too. And I think so the sort of actionable point from that work would be to ask questions about, well, what is the vision of greening that's imagined here? So Harold Perkins' work, from what I can remember, is principally about tree planting and the way that tree planting is a particular mode of greenness that is a way of reproducing the property values of largely white neighborhoods. And so what's at work there, I think, is to understand what's the social, what are the social dynamics that sit behind that vision, that imaginary, that objective, that environmental objective. And that's absolutely consistent with a form of political ecology work, which is to understand behind any claims of environmental trajectory or environmental objectives, what are the social dynamics at work behind that?
So I think the next question from Christian, I think you could pose that yourself, Christian. And I think it also overlaps a bit with the question from David Flood, really about how these sort of Western established forms of knowledge and technology and doing things often get imposed, for example, in the global South. So, but Christian, I suggest you just pose your question.
Yeah, just very quickly, it's really also from my experience, Mary, I also really support this idea of more modest sort of local infrastructures. But then whenever you propose these new ideas that are more distributed and not conformative with the existing sort of regime, then you get accused of actually then sort of denying people access to the global gold standards that are out there. And so there's a really strong tension, and how to deal with that, in a constructive way. It's sort of a key question I'm often sort of running into also in my own work.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that it's such a difficult one, and it's a difficult one given the positionalities of people like me, and I assume similar in some ways. But I think for me, this is where we have to link up to those broader imaginaries and link beyond the toilets to have a deeper understanding of all that goes into a modern sanitation system. It's not just a technology, right? It's a way of organizing resources. It's a way of organizing politics, and it's a way of organizing people. And it's based on this modernist imaginary. And if we link to the longer, wider literature about modernity in environmental studies and development studies, I think in conversations with people, I think when we put sanitation into context of who gets what, who gets the ability to flush the toilet, but also who bears the consequences of the waste, what are the finances that enabled the global north to build sewers in the first place? When we talk with people through these longer stories, I think it helps people to understand the limits of the modern system. It is also true that in many of the places that I've worked, I've intentionally worked in places where the modern ideal is no longer the dominant rhetoric. And I think 20 and 50 years ago, it would have been really hard to convince people that flushing toilets connected to a sewer for everyone wasn't the future. But part of why I've intentionally done work in Kampala and in eThekwini, Durham, South Africa, is that many people there already believe that the modern isn't going to happen. And so it's not that comparison of I could have the modern at some point, or I could have this alternative at some point. But I think that part of what is potentially compelling about this other alternative modernist imaginary is that when you spell it out beyond just the toilet, it is actually a more compelling story of politics. It's a more compelling story of control over resources. It's a more compelling story of local entrepreneurialism. And so the toilet isn't just about a toilet, right? If it's this toilet versus that toilet, it's hard to sell. But if it's this imaginary of a world and this imaginary of a world, my experience is that takes a longer conversation, but that it is as a holistic picture. The weighting changes when it's the holistic picture versus just the toilet. And I would say, just to speak then to David's question, which I agree links in nicely, for me, that is why studying in places in Africa, for example, opens possibilities for things that certainly in my neighborhood in Edinburgh, nobody uses anything other than the flushing toilet connected to the sewer, connected to the grid, which is incredibly water intensive, incredibly energy intensive. No one would fund it today, except that it was funded on colonial money way back in the day. And so that's why we're able to have it. And so in studying from alternative places, from the modern ideal, we can open up other ways of knowing, other ways of understanding the world, other ways of relating to the state. And I think that it's not to say there's this binary between Northern theory and Southern theory. I wouldn't advocate for that, but that by starting from places that sit further outside of modernity, we open spaces for something else. And that something else might well have relevance in the global north, but we might not have seen it in the global north. And so I wouldn't say that it's sort of in keeping with traditional knowledge that's part of this problematic binary, in the same way that North-South is a problematic binary, but instead to say, thinking from the South might open up possibilities for doing things differently. And so I would agree that that is a thing that political ecologists do and that I would try to do, and think toilets can be a good example of doing.
All right, so question from, I think we've covered David's question. There's a question, two questions from Huyun Gong. One is, I think, a big conceptual one. Maybe we leave that one for now in the interest of time. I think the second question then is, how can, I guess, political ecology help us understand accountability? So when some activity in one place has negative consequences for nature and or society elsewhere, how could a political ecology perspective be valuable? So I don't know who wants to go first.
Mary, I'm happy
Please.
to say a few things if you want to follow.
Yeah,
I mean,
go
I'm
for it.
going to take my lead from you, because you very helpfully pointed to Brookfield and Blakey's chains of explanation, the idea of kind of structural links in a chain. So I think one direct answer to this question, it's a really good question, Hugh, thanks for asking it, is that political ecology complicates assertions of responsibility that certainly corporate actors like to make. Corporate actors often want to draw the bounds of their responsibility. And by focusing not on the proximate causes, but on the underpinning structural causes, political ecology often wants to extend that response, extend that sort of realm of responsibility and accountability. So its orientation is towards problematizing the end point of where accountability stops, to invoke a range of getting a little crosstalk there. Anyway, I think I've made my point clear. I'll stop there.
And I would agree. I think here's where some of the environmental justice literature also, I think there's synergies, although there's some differences that are important, that I think a lot of what I've been interested in is in trying to understand those chains, and that when they are long, I myself am not convinced that these very long distances between an activity and a negative consequence can be addressed. And instead I'm interested in imaginaries that suggest to us the way we should do it is not to have these long chains where an actor on one side can do something and not feel the harm themselves. And so part of the imaginary of a modest imaginary is about trying to understand a different scale of action and interaction, because otherwise I think there isn't an answer to your final question through the conventional ways of doing things. The kind of conventional urban metabolism is always going to be dumping in some places on some edges. And I think to lightly touch the first part of your question, which I know it's in a way too big, but I think for me, this kind of modern imaginary of controlling nature is knowable through science, does still underpin some political ecology. Much of it, the kind of urban Marxist political ecology, still imagines nature as a thing that we could control if only we knew enough science, and if only we had the right people in power to control the state. And I think that there's a lot of eco-socialism that political ecologists would identify with along those lines. But I think there's also some political ecology that falls kind of in the opposite Arcadian tradition, more so the kind of some degrowth scholarship. But I think many of us are more in this, what I would call modest, and a sort of, it's not a middle ground, but it's an alternative here where we understand nature as a thing we can guide but not control. We understand it as something we can relate to, and we can anticipate what it's going to do, but we don't know it for sure. And so this sort of underpinning uncertainty for me is important to bring into the question of transitions, because we want to treat nature as a thing that we can work with, but not predict. And that, I think, should shape the kinds of technologies that we are advocating for in a sustainability transition, should shape the kind of understanding of what is sustainable as we're trying to make changes.
Wonderful. Gavin, any final words from you?
No, I have nothing else to add to that. That was brilliant.
All right, then we're almost at 3 o'clock, at least here in Norway, and time to wrap up. So I really want to thank Mary and Lawhon, Mary and Gavin for these very rich, insightful, and to me very inspirational presentations, and the great discussions, and also the participants who posed questions. So thanks a lot. This was the final seminar in this webinar series. The next steps for the Geography of Sustainability Transitions research group is that there will be, of course, a special track at the IST upcoming in Lisbon in just about a month from now. Then we are organizing a session at the 8th Geography of Innovation Conference in Budapest, Hungary next year. So the call for papers is out. So check that out if you're interested. And then there will certainly be a GEOST track at the IST conference also next year. So those are only the things planned. Surely there will be other activities. So thanks everyone for joining, and you can follow us online We also have a LinkedIn group. And if you want to get involved and contribute, maybe you have ideas for other topics we should do a webinar series on, then just get in touch with, I guess Christian is the chief of GEOST, so get Christian or one of us a mail, and we'll get back to you. So thanks a lot. Christian, did you want to add anything before we...
Yes, just very quickly, I think this was a really nice session today. So thanks a lot to the presenters and to all of you. I think this is really what GOST should be all about, to have this sort of forum where we can exchange ideas and sort of question what we do, and sort of get inspiration on how to move forward with this sort of really broad theme of geography of transition. So I think this was brilliant. I would like to take the opportunity to thank everybody who made this possible. So GOST is very much sort of a team effort, very distributed sort of people that contribute to it. So in this case, it was Camilla, Markus, Sophia Albu, and Mari Wadeberg, who really did a great job in setting this up and making this possible. So thanks a lot to you. And yeah, as Markus said, I mean, if you're interested in contributing to the group, be in touch, and also check out especially the LinkedIn page. I guess that's where we have the most up-to-date information on what's going on currently. So if you're interested in following up, just go there, and of course, always send us an email. We're really happy and open if you want to engage and make this group more lively and useful. So yeah, thanks to all of you, and hope to see you soon at another occasion, hopefully in real life even. So thanks for joining, and yeah, thanks for making this possible. See you soon.